thrilled to be introducing my colleague in anthropology, Nam Kim, who is in the archaeology section of our department, but his interests are incredibly wide-ranging. So I thought I'd just give you a sense of his life in great detail. No. So he originally did his bachelor's in international relations with a minor in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. And then he went on to do a master's in political science with a focus in international relations. And his thesis was applying transaction cost economics to the South China Sea disputes. And buried in his CV are all these interesting things that he did during that period. So he was a legal assistant. He did research and analyzed Central Asian oil and gas issues. He did research on South Asia's economy. He did stuff on internet business strategies. And then he saw the light and decided that archaeology was the center of his universe. And he went off to the University of Illinois at Chicago to do a new master's in anthropology with a focus on archaeology, and did his PhD there, writing his dissertation on the underpinnings of socio-political complexity and civilization in the Red River Valley of Middle Age Vietnam. He speaks several languages. He's proficient in French, Korean, and Vietnamese. I should have said Korean last, because I'm still wondering if he's actually gotten to see as many of the K-dramas as I sort of compare growing fluency. His research interests are archaeology of East and Southeast Asia, socio-political complexity, state formation, exchange networks, leadership strategies, formation of ancient cities, anthropology and archaeology of warfare. And he completed his PhD in 2010 and then joined our faculty. And he's been here ever since. He's been very busy doing all kinds of things, all kinds of awards, Rama's Exceptional Service Award, et cetera, et cetera. I was going to read all of the various, the number of articles, the number of conferences, but never mind all of that. But he has 3 books and 3 edited volumes. These include the Oxford Handbook of Early Southeast Asia that he edited with Charles Hyam, another issue on East and Southeast Asia that he co-edited with Alison Carter, who also was a graduate here. Another issue on warfare that he's co-edited with Fernanda Neubauer, and single-authored out of Oxford on the origins of ancient Vietnam. Another with Mark Kissel, a co-authored book, Emergent Warfare in Our Evolutionary Past, and his work on Vietnam, which he will be sharing with us today. So, with that as an introduction, welcome to your role as director of our center, and welcome to our Friday 4A series.
Thank you very much, everybody. Actually, we can dim the lights a little bit for the screen. I don't have anything to read here. Thank you, Mark. I just want to thank Mary, Ian, Catherine, and everybody else in the center's community for placing your trust in me, maybe hopefully not misplaced trust, as the incoming director. I want to thank Ian especially for his years of hard service. I want to echo what Catherine was saying earlier. We are in good shape as far as I can see moving forward, and a lot of it is thanks to the efforts of Ian Barrett. Catherine, my Korean is not as good as my Vietnamese. It's not romance dramas. I've been watching Korean zombie series. Just as interesting, and it's to improve my Korean speaking skills. So this talk actually came about because Mary had asked me earlier in the summer if I might step in for this first Friday Forum lecture. And I didn't know what I would talk about, but we landed on perhaps it could be kind of an introduction to me as well as my work. So this is a kind of a personal reflection on some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing. So this is my journey into archaeology in Vietnam. I promise for the archaeologists in the room, there is some archaeology in here, but I wanted to make sure that we can see a sort of case study about how archaeology is done in this country, but also how it fits into a wider context, what it means to stakeholders and people in the present, and what that material, all the relics, the artifacts, the landscapes, the sites, what they can mean for modern Vietnamese notions of identity. And to talk about this, just a little bit of backdrop before we begin this journey. We think about Vietnam as it is today. You can see this long coastal country. You have the bordering areas around Vietnam within Southeast Asia, and then just to the north we have China. And the time period that we're talking about, that we're going to look at to begin our story, has to do with eras about 2,000 plus years ago. So during this time period, the modern day borders of Vietnam, of Laos, Cambodia, China, they did not exist. We can see from historical records, also from archaeological materials, there's a sort of kaleidoscope of societies along southern China and in parts of northern Vietnam. So this would be specifically in the Red River Valley and Delta, in the northern part of Vietnam, also known as Bac Bo. So around 2,000 plus years ago, there are many different communities, probably various different languages, some of which we have some ideas about, some of which we don't know that much about, and different ethnic identities. But we can see from the material record, shared practices, exchanges of bronzes, for instance, moving throughout these regions. If you are interested, you can look at some of the work by historians like Erica Brindley who talk about this area and this idea of the Yue, which gives us the appellation of Viet. So when we think about Viet notions of identity, this is the world that provides a starting point. The actual term for Vietnam, and we can see from work by historians like Chris Gosha, they describe when it starts to become common to use the term of Vietnam. And in the early 19th century, we start to see the idea of Viet itself, this identity, coming into use in this appellation of Vietnam. So Nam being south, so this is the southern part of this world. And this is the culmination of millennia of cultural change and history. And actually, if you look closely at Chris Gosha's book, the introduction itself talks about the many different Vietnams. And this is important for us to use as a backdrop because we can see, if you go to Vietnam today, we're talking about dozens of different ethnic identities. If we're talking about change over time, the number of communities, languages, identities that existed, many of which probably are lost to us now, it's probably mind-boggling. But if we just look at snapshots through time, from the 10th to the 18th centuries, Vietnam, from the north, this idea of Viet begins to expand southward, eventually culminating in what we see in this long coastal country. Then we have early 19th, 20th century histories as well, with French Indochina. The French come into the picture. Massive changes beginning to happen. The beginnings of professional archaeology also within this time period as conducted by the French. And then of course, all of us are familiar with what's happening in the 20th century. On the heels of World War II, into the conflicts that we know as the Vietnam War here in the United States. I'm going to close the software update here. Okay. For me, there are a couple of takeaways from this sort of overview of these map snapshots. One, it shows us that if we're going to talk about the origins of Viet identity and civilization, we're looking at the north, that area right around the area of Hanoi today. The second thing is, when we think about all of these massive political, geopolitical, historical changes that are happening, they cannot be separated from our interpretations of the past, from our historical reconstructions, and from our interpretations of the material record. They're connected in very complex ways, and we'll see some of that in this talk. To shift gears a little bit, so we're going to start on the other side of the Eurasian landmass. This is a map showing us the Imperial period of the Roman Empire, something like 2,100 years ago, 1st century BCE. And what we can see is the sort of stretch of Roman influence. The Romans viewed a lot of the surrounding communities as unsophisticated, the so-called barbarians on the outskirts. They had very colorful views and descriptions about this barbarian world on their fringes. If we move across that Eurasian landmass to the east, we think about this area that would be present-day China. The Central Plains, right here in this darker shade of red. Around the same time period, we start to see the imperial period of China. When the Warring States period starts to come to an end, the Qin, in particular, coming into power, taking over and conquering the surrounding areas, the other kingdoms. The Qin are very famous for the terracotta soldiers. If many of you are familiar with the Imperial tomb of Shibangdi, they conquer, they take over, and this kicks off the imperial historical period for ancient China. Now, not long after the Qin fall, we have the Han Empire taking over. And it's this type period of interest that is significant for people in Vietnam, because the Han began to expand the borders further and further afield. They reach into areas of what would be northern Vietnam today, areas of the Korean Peninsula, and so forth. In particular, I just want to highlight these two areas. I'll come back to that in just a second, but we can see how when the Han began to expand, they had a similar view, similar to what we see. This is the typical imperial trope, right, about the barbarians on the fringes. When they expand, we have chronicles about what they see when they come south, for instance. There's an ascribed date of 111 BCE when the Han purportedly annexed this part of northern Vietnam. And we have chronicles by people like Sima Qian who write about what they encounter. They talk about the unsophisticated locals who lack governance, who lack sophistication in farming techniques, in metallurgy, and so forth, and that they were, quote unquote, in need of civilizing. Right? It was the Han that had to bring all this material and these cultural practices to them. This is a very important backdrop for what we see 2,000 years ago and what we see even today. There's a very long and complicated sort of view within Vietnam about this relationship to China. The Vietnamese civilization, if we can call it that, Vietnamese, for many people dates back to this time period before the annexation by the Chinese. And we know that after the Chinese arrived, there's about 1,000 years that they would stay, more or less. There are different rebellions and revolts that happen throughout the course of that millennium. But it's not until the 10th century that the Vietnamese feel as though they have regained independence. There was an article or an op-ed by Tung Lai back in 2014 in the New York Times. And I won't read you the whole thing, but there's one quote that comes from here that I think is telling. The Vietnamese people have long fought for thousands of years to maintain their culture and independence in the shadow of this giant neighbor. For us, this is relevant when we think about this idea of the past and its importance. The late archaeologist Ian Glover was writing about the uses of archaeology, of history for national identity and other kinds of purposes, whether we're talking about East Asia or Southeast Asia. And he talks about Vietnam specifically, and he considers how interesting it is that a country that he said was so materially poor at the time was so interested and devoted so much investment and attention onto the past, onto the archaeological record. And he says that the past is a moral force in Vietnam. And increasingly, throughout the 20th century, identity and archaeology and history were becoming intertwined. One of the four pillars of Vietnamese history during the 20th century is the scholar known as Ha Van Dun. And he wrote in this article about archaeology and as it was occurring within Vietnam. There are different periods of time that we can point to. We talked about before 1945, the end of World War II, the field of archaeology was firmly within the domain of the French, so FAO and other institutions. They were very interested in the big monuments around the country, and they were not quite as interested in specific details about cultural history of the Vietnamese. After 1945, things begin to change. We have the establishment of North Vietnam, And archaeological research begins to take on a higher imperative, a different kind of imperative. We know that the Battle of Dien Bien Phu happens in 1954. It marks the end of French Indochina and Vietnam and independence. And at that point in time, Ho Chi Minh talks about the need to preserve cultural heritage within the country. And by that, he meant it's not just the historical records, but it's the material records as well. So he often visited sites, archaeological sites, even during times of conflict and turmoil. And he helped to establish what is now the National Institute of Archaeology, based in Hanoi. Historian Yu Ting Nguyen at Temple University wrote this article about myth in Vietnam. And it's interesting because we can see in the 20th century this concerted effort to incorporate, maybe even appropriate elements of the past. But we know that this has been happening in the entity of Vietnam going back even further. So as far back as the 15th century, we know that various dynasties of the Viet court were very interested in the past, collecting materials, texts, folk tales, myths, collecting artifacts as a form of meta-narrative construction. So how do we identify the relics of our kingdoms, of our dynasties? How do we unify the populace under a certain aegis within the imperial state? This was happening as far back as the 15th century. During that period, one dynasty in particular, the Hung kings, were known to be the first dynasty. They were purportedly the first. This was according to myth. And they were viewed as the ancestral founders of the Viet people. This takes us to my personal connection now to the Viet identity. I joke with people how I'm sort of a Cold War mutt. So if you hear my last name, it's Kim. And if you know anything about Kim, you know that it is sort of the Smith of Korea. So when I go to Vietnam, nobody thinks I'm Vietnamese. Nobody thinks I look Vietnamese. And my name certainly doesn't belie that, aside from maybe now. But if we think about that area of the Han imperial map that they consider the barbarian world, I'm of that barbarian ancestry. So if we're thinking about the Korean Peninsula, northern Vietnam, on the fringes. I was born in Saigon in 1974. And that's a photograph of my mother and me. So at this point, I'm about a year old. But that photograph was taken in April of '75. My parents and I evacuated from the rooftop of the USAID building in April 29, 1975. This is not the photograph of that evacuation, but it's a similar. This is a very famous photograph captured by Hugh Van Ness. But in a similar fashion, we left Vietnam. My father is Korean. This is a photograph. I don't know if you recognize, anybody recognizes. This is what's known as the Punch Bowl. This is in the Gangwon province in Korea, in the DMZ. I got to visit it right before the pandemic. It was my last trip overseas before the pandemic. I gave some guest lectures in South Korea, and I got to go to the DMZ and visit this place because my father had served in the war and was here. He remembers very vividly. He was very young when the Korean War happened. This is a photograph of him right around the time that he was deployed to the Punch Bowl area. So that's one side of my Cold War mutt history. The other side is in Vietnam. So this is my mother's family and extended family in the Ninh Binh province up in the north of Vietnam. This is in the 1950s. My mother is standing right here. She's probably, I think, about 6 or 7 years old at the time. My father ends up in Vietnam in the 1960s. This is a photograph of him at the Korean embassy in, this is probably around 1973, 1974. In any case, it's a very long story. I don't have time to go into detail, but they meet in Saigon in the 1960s. They're married in 1973. I'm born a year later. And then a year after that, we see change, massive change between the two countries. So, and the history of the Civil War. This is the Korean embassy on April 29, 1975. My parents made very desperate decisions at that point in time about whether to stay or to leave. my mother not wanting to go because she was the youngest in her family, older siblings, parents, and so forth. But they convinced her that she needed to leave. If you're interested in this, there's a documentary called The Last Days in Vietnam. It came out a few years ago. I actually had the privilege of watching that with my parents, and I could see in their eyes as they were watching. For me, it was more interesting to watch their reaction than to watch the film. But they remembered very vividly those last few weeks leading up to those moments of our departure. But this is a photograph my father took. So he was in Vietnam working as a businessman, but also as a photojournalist with the Korean embassy. He had a bag of cameras with him. So when we left, we had very little material possessions with us at the time, but he did have his camera, and he took photographs. We left by helicopter from Saigon, went out to the airport. From there, flew out to the coast, to Vũng Tàu, and from there, boarded one of these barges. The barge had humans, like cattle, hundreds, transported to ships like this. I believe this is the USS Kimbrough, where we spent the first few days of our journey out of Vietnam, not knowing where we were going to be headed, along with other families. Eventually, we made our way from here out to the Philippines, to refugee camps there, and then to Guam. This is Oro Point in Guam. This is in May now, several weeks later. My mother and me. We had no idea that there would ever be a chance to return. In fact, when we left, my mother, you can see the look on her face, thought that was the last time she'd ever see Vietnam or her family. From there, we were part of what's known as Operation New Life. We were given the opportunity to travel to a different part of the world, to arrive as refugee immigrants. And my parents chose the United States, and we ended up in a refugee camp at Fort Eglin in Florida, Air Force Base. So that's the beginnings of my knowledge of Vietnam. Coming to this country, hearing these stories from my parents about our flight from that country, not thinking as I was growing up in the United States that I'd have any connection to it later on. It wasn't until the ripe age of 30 when I finally went back to graduate school for anthropology and started to think about doing field work in an area of the world that I had the possibility to go back. So I went back to Vietnam in 2005 for the first time, just to see if there was an opportunity to do field work. I was very, very fortunate that I was given an option to work in Vietnam and to choose where to work. If you go to Vietnam, you can see, for instance, this very important connection between the past and the present. Here we have this tapestry that shows, I mentioned earlier, the home kings of the Văn Lang Kingdom. This tapestry illustrates that history. As the article that we highlighted earlier shows, they're viewed as the venerated ancestors of the Vietnamese people. This tapestry is on the wall at what's known as the Reunification Palace in Ho Chi Minh City, which was Saigon before. We know that when Ho Chi Minh declared independence in 1945 in the middle of Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi, he actually references this legendary past and says, we are the descendants of these kings. We are the descendants, and we have the right for our own self-determination, sovereignty. So he invokes that. And that kicks off, as we intimated earlier, this sort of search for not only the historical relics of the past, the evidence and texts and chronicles, and also the material correlates for those stories. And as we talked about, the story starts up in the north. So here we have the Red River Valley, which many people view to be the nucleus, or the crucible for an emerging Vietnamese civilization. And our reconstructions of that past rely on a mix of information. In some cases, we have legends and folktales, oral traditions. In some cases, we have text. And then increasingly, we have archaeology that describe these time periods and what's happening in that geographic space. In particular, for archaeology, we are very interested in a couple of things. One would be what's known as the Dom Son culture. The other is the Koloa site. Many of you are probably familiar with the Dom Son culture. We're looking at first millennium BCE rice farming communities within the region. They're famous for their boat coffin burials, like this one that was found in the 1960s in Haiphong. We have artifacts associated with that material culture and very elaborate bronzes, vessels, ritual vessels, weapons, farming implements, drums. Dome stone are spread all throughout the northern part of Vietnam, extending down into areas of central Vietnam. They're famous for their bronzes especially, but we start to see inklings of social inequality and stratification, the beginnings of what archaeologists and anthropologists call complexity, social complexity. We see it in the burials, we see it in workshops, we see it in iconography, showing us some of the lifeways of the communities in existence at this time. This is right on the cusp of history. The Yeongsun did not write about themselves, but they are described by surrounding communities, like the Sinitic ones, that start to come in and encounter them. So we have bronzes like these, various kinds of implements, very elaborately decorated, and in particular the drums are what typify the Yeongsun culture. These sit at the National Museum in Hanoi today. One of them is this specimen that was found at the site of Go Loa, which I'll talk about in just a second. This is one of the finest specimens that's been uncovered. They estimate that 1,000 to 7,000 kilograms of crude raw ore material might have been used just to produce this one drum. Very elaborately decorated. You can see the kinds of motifs on the star-shaped design in the middle. You can see plumed warriors holding weapons and these cranes along this band on the tympanum. We think about some of those motifs, you can see that there was that band of cranes. I took this photograph a few years ago driving into the city of Thanh Hoa in Vietnam. As you come into the city along the highway, you are greeted with this massive structure, this monument, with the cranes, with the replica of the drum right in the middle. If you look at postcards, if you look at various buildings, architectural designs, if you look at tea packaging, you can see those motifs prominently displayed. And we can imagine the reason why they are so prominently displayed. This is the last culture, or archaeological culture, that we can point to before the arrival of the Han. So 111 BCE. All of this purportedly exists well before the Han come into the picture. So if we think about that, when we think about other sites around Vietnam from that time period, the one I want to focus on is Go Loa. This is where my colleagues and I have been doing field work going back some time now. It's located here in the northern part of the delta. And here is downtown Hanoi. This is the Thăng Long Citadel. Some of you may know this is the sort of capital of Vietnam during the so-called medieval period. And if you turn your attention to the north, right across the river, about 15 kilometers away is the site of Go Loa. I am fascinated by this image because it shows how this particular geographic space has been a locus of cultural significance and political power in Vietnam going back thousands of years. I'm sure you recognize this image. Yes? We are right here in Madison. So there's Camp Randall. Same scale. So this is the Go Loa site. Okay, just to give you an idea of the size of this ancient settlement. Here's another one. That's Central Park. And then on the same scale, Go Loa. For many people thinking about Southeast Asia, Go Loa doesn't come to mind when we're talking about history or archaeology. Oftentimes you might hear of sites like Angkor. So here's Angkor Wat, that famous temple in Siem Reap in Cambodia. And here's Go Loa in the same scale. We're talking about a settlement that is roughly 600 hectares, 6 square kilometers in size. 450 hectares of it enclosed by the wall, the outer wall that we can see. If this is the case, that's the correct size, we're looking at potentially the largest prehistoric settlement anywhere in Southeast Asia, the largest and potentially earliest. Angkor itself comes into existence in the first millennium of the Common Era. So we're talking about centuries before that, and yet many people outside of Vietnam don't know about this particular case study. If you look at the satellite photos, you can see the three rampart features. This is the inner wall. This is about 1.65 kilometers around in its perimeter. The middle wall is about 6.5 kilometers, and the outer wall is about 8 kilometers around. We think that between 1 and 2 million cubic meters of earth and materials were moved to construct these walls. They still stand today in various states of disrepair, maybe about 10 meters in height in some places, 4 to 5 meters in other places, 20 to 30 meters wide in some places. You can see the dense habitation here. This is the Golwar commune. We have thousands of residents that are here. So because of modern day habitation at the site, lots of changes are happening, lots of development. We also don't have access to the entire area in order to test various hypotheses and do field investigations. So it limits or restricts the kinds of questions we can ask, but the kinds of proxies we might use to answer our questions. One big question, obviously, given the history between China and Vietnam, given the fact that the Han do come in and annex this part of the world, a lot of people have debated whether or not this is indigenous. Was this here before the Han or after the Han arrival? Does anybody know where we are here? We're not Vietnam anymore. We're in Europe. This is the ruins of what's known as Tintagel Castle in the UK. For some people, it is connected to Arthurian legends and tales. They talk about what might have been here. Some of the archaeology has been done here. It's inconclusive, but there are tantalizing clues about when the site was occupied and some of the cultural history of it. The reason I bring this up is because if we think about the tales of Arthur, the Lady of the Lake supplying Excalibur to King Arthur as a sort of weapon and symbol of power, there are similar kinds of stories. I'm not saying that they're related, but there are similar kinds of stories in Vietnam regarding Go Loa. Go Loa was supposedly constructed by a king by the name of An Giang Vuong. An Giang Vuong reportedly had advice from a turtle that came out of the water, telling him how to build his defenses, how to construct the walls in his capital city. The turtle purportedly took one of its claws and gave it to the king and said, use this as the trigger mechanism for your crossbow. This will allow you to vanquish all of your enemies. So we have these sort of colorful tales. They come to us over centuries, over millennia. That's one source of information, these Vietnamese folktales. They are in accounts. Many of them were passed on through generations orally. We don't see them recorded until much later. But they do describe something that's happening at 258 or 257 BC. This kingdom purportedly coming to existence, known as the Olak Kingdom, that overthrows the Hun kings, with An Giang Vuong as its founding monarch. According to the legends, he establishes Go Loa, he built up the city. There are 9 walls built around it in the pattern of a snail shell. Historians have questioned whether or not, say, well, this is from texts that were written down centuries after the time period that they describe. This is written down after the Vietnamese court regains independence. Maybe there's some kind of embellishment, national pride that might affect interpretations and how people view the past. So maybe some of these stories were invented or exaggerated. On the other hand, you have the Chinese side with their chronicles describing what they see. And as we mentioned before, we have talk of barbarians that were unsophisticated. We have to question those accounts as well, because they could be biased because of their imperial views. They could have been very ethnocentric. But we have this sort of conflicting depiction between the two sides. Was the civilization that we see here, the Dongsun material, the city, was that attributable to the arrival of this foreign power, or did it predate all of that? And without archaeological data, it'd be hard to know. If we relied just on the text, we would not be able to resolve this debate. So this is what prompted some of the research that my colleagues and I have been doing over the last several years. Excavating at Go Loa to try to find information. So I mentioned that we have issues with accessing certain areas, there's probably a lot of material in the central parts of the site that can be very informative for us. But to start, it's very difficult. So we decided that the walls might serve as a proxy measure for the emergence of the city itself, as a form of monumentality. Who was able to construct these monuments? There were 3 separate excavations that happened over the years at each of the walls. And I'll just briefly summarize some of our findings and talk about the implications. You can see the massive size of the ramparts. We're looking at this part of the middle wall. This was the first excavations, something like 4.5 meters in height, over 20 meters wide at the base. Similar kinds of features and dimensions for the outer and inner walls. With that material in the middle wall in particular, at the bottom of the excavations, we found these very unusual features, a platform with a ditch around it. And within it, we found materials related to the Dong Son culture specifically. So these are fragments of pottery from that Dong Son culture that is found all throughout northern Vietnam, with radiocarbon dates showing us a time period of about 500 to 300 BC. Above that, we see construction sequences of the monumental rampart. And here you can make out these blocks of earthen materials. They're almost like artifacts, if you think about it. The blocks themselves giving us an idea of the composition as well as the construction process, the sequences, how they were being built. In some cases, this mound-like structure being built up as a foundation. Above it, layers of rammed or stamped earth. For us, the most important or interesting part in today's conversation would be this period that we see the bulk of that rampart being constructed. This is between 300 and 100 calibrated BCE. This is based on radiocarbon dates of organic materials as well as thermoluminescence dating from some of the ceramic materials. Above that phase of construction, at the top of the ancient rampart, we see a layer of artifacts, and they're fragments of ceramic roof tiles. Within this one excavation alone, in the middle wall, we had several thousand fragments of roof tiles found. And what we know is that they are found all over the wall. Anywhere you put a road into the wall or you see parts of the wall collapsing, you see the same layer of roof tiles. There are all kinds of possibilities for why they're there. Unfortunately, we didn't find any post holes, so we're not sure if there was a roof-like structure above the rampart itself. There could have been. It also was suggested perhaps this is debris, garbage, that was placed here to help shore up against erosion during monsoonal rain seasons. That interpretation, all those possible interpretations are still ongoing, but we did find materials as well as charcoal with roof tiles giving us this window of construction. It's a sort of upper limit of the construction. And the other thing that's interesting is you don't see roof tiles anywhere else in Vietnam until centuries later. Nowhere else. It's just at this one place. And it's very reminiscent of roof tiles that are found in the areas of southern China that are associated with royal or elite buildings. So one suspicion is that perhaps this is some form of emulation, because this is before the Chinese footprint within northern Vietnam. But perhaps they are very aware of the trappings of authority as used elsewhere. And those symbols are being replicated and used locally. So we can talk about some of those materials. If we think back to the drum itself, we also know that in areas of the inner wall, there were excavations that uncovered furnaces, casting materials to produce bronzes like crossbow bolts, crossbow triggers made of bronze, also recovered in these areas. And that suggests to us that we have some kind of centralized authority that's responsible. The dates come back for the walls within a similar range. Not just the middle wall, but the outer and middle and inner walls as well seem to have been constructed around the same time. This suggests a centralized society, maybe pre-planned in some fashion, with the construction of those monuments, with control over very valuable kinds of resources and technologies. So what would be the implications of these archaeological data, especially when we think about this notion of Viet? Whether or not there was a person named An Giang Vuong or the Ola Kingdom, I reserve judgment on that. I have colleagues who will tell you this is definitive. We have found evidence that the time period is right, the place is right, therefore those histories are 100% valid. He existed, that kingdom existed. For me, that might be the case, but we can't rule out other possibilities just yet. But what we can say is when we look at the corpus of materials, something very complex was certainly here before the arrival of the Han. I refer to it as the Kolaw polity. Others might call it the Olaf kingdom. But we have this window of when this society likely existed. And we know that this is the culmination of change from earlier eras through that period, and it's still going on through today. And I'll talk very briefly about some of our ongoing work. With colleagues, we've been accessing areas of the site through remote sensing. So as I mentioned, it's difficult to dig everywhere. We don't have the time, resources, or permission to be able to do so. But we've been doing magnetometry to try to find areas of interest, to identify features or artifact scatters under the surface through magnetometry. And I just want to share very briefly, this is the first time, these projects were the first of their kind to be applied at this site. And here's an example. This is location number 12. It's a rice paddy. You can see one of the ramparts in the background there. And at this particular location, we swept the surface with the mag and found areas of interest. We decided to put in 2 test excavations, trenches right there at 1 and 2, locations 1 and 2. And this is what we found. Burials. Now, these burials, the human remains have not survived. The soils are a bit too acidic for that, but the artifacts are clear. And the materials date to the late dynasty periods, 18th century. We suspect that maybe this might have been a cemetery for that dynasty, that time period. Maybe there are more burials. We only uncovered the 2 here. But for us, this is proof of concept. This was to show our colleagues that our method of detecting sites of interest can work without having to excavate, dig up the entire area. This is not a period of particular interest for our story, but it shows how the method is very valuable. In recent years, we were also able to obtain LiDAR data from this national agency. So this particular agency has been doing LiDAR flights, collecting data up and down Vietnam. My colleagues in archaeology were not aware of this until very recently. So once we found out, we approached the folks at this office and asked, can we purchase some of those data so that we can apply them for archaeological investigation? And here is an early image. We're still analyzing many of these data sets. But I want to point out a couple of things that might be interesting to us. If we look right here, one of the things that you can make out is on the middle wall itself, regularly spaced on the surface, there are these bumps. They are corresponding to protrusions from the foot of the wall going out to the exterior. They seem to be spaced at regular intervals. They don't appear to be natural. They're spaced something like 80 to 90 kilometers apart. Once we saw that from the LiDAR, from ground truthing, which is on the ground observation, we could determine or hypothesize that perhaps these are bastions, the bases of watchtowers or defensive features on top of the ramparts. They're spaced evenly because the firing distance, the effective firing distance of their projectile technology. The other thing that we started to hypothesize about is this area. So this is the inner wall, that rectangle. You see that little area to the southwest corner of it. And the suspicion is that perhaps that is another wall itself. There is another wall within the wall that nobody had ever talked about. So just from a little bit of time of initially looking at some of the imagery, we're starting to see things that we can further test. But one of the things that we're noticing is perhaps there are more walls. So the legends, if you recall, said that there were 9 walls altogether. People thought maybe this was a fairy tale and that we only see the 3. But it's quite possible that over the millennia, many of the other architectural features have been obliterated, maybe have eroded, but the remnants might still be there. Maybe there's a way for us, and we are thinking, and this is just this past summer, none of this is published yet, we're still working this out, but we think we can get up to 8 or 9 based on some of the preliminary work. We're also collecting soil samples for botanical remains to try to reconstruct environments. If you look at those remains, you might be able to see what kinds of vegetation would have existed, how that changed in time, so you can see the human environment footprint as it changes over the millennia. So we're hoping to be able to do that as well. We are also very interested in the production of bronze and how it might be connected, not just to areas of northern Vietnam, but also to areas much further afield in parts of China and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. I want to wrap this up, talk a little bit about what this means for us. So that opening image shows this festival that happens at the Loire that commemorates this history, the king, the kingdom, and so forth, An Dinh Vuc. And for me, it illustrates how that episode and these stories can be part of what's known as the imagination of the country. The archaeological past then can be a very important part of that, an integral foundation for that kind of identity formation. I found this recently. This is a video game. Some of you know the game Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, maybe, yes? This is a Vietnamese version of something like that. And you can select a character to pit against another character. If you look closely, you can see this individual holding this magic crossbow. That's An Dinh Vuc. So it is in the imagination of the modern day. We have stories about An Dinh Vuc in video games, in literature, in history books, in cartoons that are shown to children. That story permeates the sort of genesis, what people view as the genesis of Viet identity. And if you go to Golwa today, we have an exhibition hall, this museum that houses many of the relics that have been unearthed and curated. We have festivals and rituals that take place at the site. We have military figures, researchers, children, foreigners. Does this look familiar? That's made of clay, made by school children. So they take field trips to Golwa, and they're given materials to reconstruct the history. They participate in crossbow firing contests, all commemorating this history. So we can talk about how it is persistent to this very day. What's also interesting to me to think about is, we mentioned that the Han annexed this part of the world. The Chinese would stay throughout the first millennium of the Common Era. In the 10th century, there is a dynasty known as the Ngo dynasty. King Ngo, whose statue stands here, leads a rebellion, a war against the Chinese. There's a very famous battle at the river mouth of Bac Ta, and repels the Chinese, kicking off this independence for Viet society. It's said that when he comes into power, instead of using downtown Hanoi, that area where the Thăng Long Citadel is, as his capital, that had been the locus of power for the Chinese, he instead moves the locus of power, its capital seat, back across the river to the old site of Golwa. Now, we can speculate about why he might have done this, but some people argue perhaps it is because echoes of that history persisted through the generations. That he, in his mind, thought this is a way to appeal to that distant past. So much like Ho Chi Minh might have said, we are the descendants of that glorious past, maybe he was thinking something similar. And this goes right through today. So while we were excavating, we had visits by national politicians, the former president of Vietnam, the deputy prime minister, coming to the site, asking us, what are you finding coming out of the ground? I can be honest with you, as a graduate student doing this, it was very nerve-wracking to have that kind of political attention placed on us. But it gives us an idea of just how important the past is for many, many different stakeholders in the present in the country. And that is a source of pride in Vietnam today for people in Vietnam, but also for people outside of Vietnam who have ancestry to that past. There are many voices, many different agendas, and it is a very complex picture of how cultural heritage should be managed and safeguarded. I'm happy to talk about that as well. I want to highlight something before we start to wrap up here. This is a novel that was just published last month by Phung Nguyen, and he's going to be here next month, actually, giving a Friday Forum lecture. This is a novel about the Trung Sister Rebellion that happens in the 1st century, the rebellion against the Han Empire. And I want to point out a couple of things. That he has talked about this. If you go to some of his websites and podcasts, he talks about how historical fiction blends history and myth, and how it's very important for the local, for the individual, but also for the wider community. And one of the things that we can see is he references the bronze drum, the timpani, very similar, right? So these stories are all connected, and they're coming to us not just in these monuments, but also in these narratives, in fiction. And this is a quote that I really enjoy from him, because myth is useful not just to nations and the powerful who rule, but to our psyches on an individual and global scale. But I just wanted to plug this lecture that's coming up. And finally, these are my parents today. So at the height of the pandemic, this is July 2020, we decided it was better for them to get out of Arizona, which was a hotbed at the time, and to come to Madison. So my brothers and I and other relatives, we engineered this extraction. And it was a very sobering and interesting experience. And it dawned on me and my parents, as we were driving to their new residence, that this was 45 years after they carried me out of turmoil, right? And now their son was carrying them away from what we saw as turmoil during the pandemic. But they are alive and healthy and very close by. But that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.